You're useless and ugly. I only married you for your money. Useless paraplegic, just a burden. You're useless and ugly. I only married you for your money. The paraplegic millionaire was ignored by his fiancée. The employee did something no one expected. The silence in the opulent Rosedale mansion, overlooking the peaceful ravine, was dense, heavy, almost suffocating. Ethan Blackwood, a 32-year-old man, who barely 12 months ago seemed to have the entire world in the palm of his hand, spent his afternoons watching the sunlight crawl across the immense marble floor of his living room. Observing dust motes float in the shafts of light had become his new bitter routine. He was an immensely powerful man, a magnate in the technology and real estate sectors, whose fortune was conservatively valued at over $400 million CAD. He had built an empire from nothing, driven by relentless ambition and a fierce intelligence that refused to take no for an answer. However, all that wealth, all the properties, shares, and absolute power had been unable to buy back his leg's ability to take a single step. The accident still replayed in his mind like a worn but persistent film. It was a night of torrential rain on the highway to Muskoka. The slippery asphalt, a poorly judged curve by a drunk driver coming in the opposite direction, and then the deafening crash of metal crushing. Ethan remembered the smell of gasoline, the penetrating cold of the rain seeping through the shattered windshield, and the terrifying, absolute lack of sensation from the waist down. When he awoke in the sterile room of that private hospital, surrounded by the best medical minds money could buy, the diagnosis was an irrevocable verdict. Severe spinal cord injury, paraplegia. Since then, Ethan's life had drastically reduced in movement, but amplified in resentment. The outside world continued to spin. His companies continued to generate millions in dividends under the guardianship of his board of directors, but he felt like a ghost inhabiting his own luxurious mausoleum. The mansion, once the setting for lavish parties of Toronto's high society, now felt like a gilded cage. The immense mahogany doors, vaulted ceilings, and winding staircases, which once symbolized his triumph, were now constant reminders of his physical limitations. Physically, Ethan remained an imposing man. His face retained the ruggedness and attractiveness that so many financial magazine covers had captured. A defined jawline, now shadowed by a dark, well-maintained beard that gave him an air of premature maturity, and short, dark hair. However, his eyes, which once gleamed with the ambition to conquer the world, now harbored a perpetual storm of frustration and dark cynicism. Seated in his state-of-the-art wheelchair, a marvel of lightweight engineering made of carbon fiber and titanium, Ethan refused to wear the custom-tailored suits that once defined his daily armor. He had opted for the bitter comfort of confinement, habitually wearing light gray track pants and fitted long-sleeved shirts of the same hue garments that did not hide the musculature of his torso, but contrasted with the forced inactivity of his legs, where he often felt phantom pains, real electrical discharges in nerves that no longer communicated with his brain. The most devastating aspect of his new reality, however, was not the physical pain, but the brutal revelation of human nature, specifically that of the woman who wore a 5-carat engagement ring on her left hand, Genevieve Dubois. Genevieve and he had been the golden couple of the city's elite. She, a dazzlingly beautiful, 8-year-old woman, from an old Montreal family with dwindling bank accounts, had seen in Ethan her financial salvation and her passport to the peak of social status. Before the accident, their relationship was filled with trips to the French Riviera, dinners at restaurants where reservations were made months in advance, and appearances on the most exclusive red carpets. Genevieve was the perfect companion for a ruthless businessman, an undeniable trophy, charming when the situation required it, and perfectly adapted to an environment of extreme luxury. But the accident had stripped the relationship of its superficial varnish, revealing the rotten wood beneath. When Ethan returned home in his wheelchair, in need of emotional support, and in the first months, physical assistance, Genevieve simply retreated. She could not stand the sight of weakness. Ethan's vulnerability silently disgusted her, though she never said it aloud in front of cameras or friends. Her tactic was evasion. She began to fill her schedule with irrelevant charity events, long sessions at exclusive spas, and endless shopping trips in Yorkville and abroad. All, of course, financed by Ethan's credit card with an infinite limit. She had become an absent housemate, a stranger who slept in the same mansion but was emotionally miles away. Ethan saw the charges on his accounts, the exorbitant sums spent in European boutiques and exclusive designers, and he said nothing. He let her spend his money as a kind of silent compensation for having to endure the existence of a disabled man in her life. It was a tactical, poisoned agreement. He paid for her lifestyle. She maintained the appearance of not having abandoned him in his worst moment. This particular afternoon, the mansion's solitude seemed heavier than ever. The overcast sky of Toronto filtered a melancholic light through the enormous windows. Ethan glided in his wheelchair to the center of the immense main living room, a space designed to impress, but which now only served to make him feel small. He watched the antique wall clock hanging above the large stone fireplace, listening to its rhythmic tick-tock. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his dark hair. He was tired, not physically, but exhausted in his soul, of the farce of his engagement, and of the endless wait for a miracle that science had already assured him would never come. The main living room of the Blackwood mansion was a masterpiece of classic and opulent interior design. It was dominated by a spectacular crystal chandelier that hung from the high ceiling, fragmenting the scarce afternoon light into small rainbow prisms that danced on the cold, impeccable marble floors. Large windows framed by heavy, elegant dark brown drapes that fell from ceiling to floor offered a view of the manicured exterior gardens. At one end of the room, a large carved stone fireplace anchored the space, surrounded by carefully restored antique furniture, velvet sofas, and coffee tables of exotic woods. In the exact center of this grandeur, creating an almost painful contrast, sat Ethan. Seated in his modern black wheelchair, he wore his usual informal attire, light gray track pants, and a matching long-sleeved shirt that clung to his broad shoulders and strong arms. His posture was rigid, his face serious, enveloped in a deeply pensive expression. His dark eyes stared into nothingness, lost in the marble's void. The silence was abruptly broken by the dry, rhythmic sound of high heels tapping on the stone of the entrance. It was Genevieve. She had just returned from what had evidently been a marathon afternoon in the city's most exclusive boutiques. At 28, her presence was still magnetic and striking. Her long, straight dark hair fell perfectly over her shoulders. She wore an outfit that seemed to scream for attention. A shiny, very tight silver metallic ensemble, consisting of a short jacket and trousers that clung to her long legs. She wore towering silver heels that echoed like hammer blows in the house's silence. Behind her, two mansion employees silently carried the day's spoils, depositing the bags on the floor near Ethan's wheelchair before quickly retreating with a slight bow. There were several luxury shopping bags, visually dominated by a huge shiny black bag with the logo of an exclusive Parisian fashion brand printed in gold letters, flanked by several high-end thick brown paper bags. Genevieve stopped a few steps from Ethan. She did not greet him or even look him in the eyes. In her right hand, she held her latest smartphone, her eyes fixed on the screen, her face frozen in a neutral, almost distant and haughty expression. Her thumbs moved quickly across the glass, answering messages or checking her social media, completely oblivious to the man she was supposed to marry. For her, Ethan at that moment was as invisible as the air, a piece of the mansion's furniture that she simply had to ignore so as not to spoil her mood. In that instant of silent tension and emotional abandonment, a third figure entered the room, bringing with her a completely different energy. It was Clara Mackenzie, one of the mansion's newest service employees. At 25, Clara possessed a natural and serene beauty that did not need metallic outfits or excessive makeup to stand out. She was dressed in the classic uniform required by the house's housekeeper, a dark gray, short but modest dress, covered by an impeccably ironed white apron, with matching white collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was gathered in a neat low bun at the nape of her neck, clearing her face of soft features and incredibly expressive eyes. Clara advanced with silent, careful steps, holding a heavy silver tray with both hands. On the tray rested two elegant fine porcelain cups that steamed lightly, filled with tea and dark coffee, accompanied by small sugar bowls and tiny silver spoons that tinkled softly with each step. Her intention was to leave the service on the coffee table so that the couple would have something warm on that gray afternoon. As Clara approached, Genevieve, without taking her eyes off her phone, took a sharp step back to adjust her posture, inadvertently bumping into one of the heavy shopping bags. The movement was sudden. The bag fell forward, hitting Ethan's immobile knee. Ethan gave a slight start, more from the unexpected impact than from the pain he could not feel, and his arm moved spasmodically, an uncontrollable reflex of his injured body. His hand collided squarely with the edge of the silver tray that Clara was about to place on the table. The sound of metal falling on marble was strident. One of the porcelain cups overturned, spilling the dark coffee over the gleaming tray and lightly splashing the floor and the edge of Ethan's wheelchair. The spoons clattered loudly, scattering across the floor. Genevieve, at the noise, finally looked up from her screen, frowning with a deep expression of disgust, looked at the small mess on the floor, then at Ethan, and let out an impatient click of her tongue. "For God's sake, Ethan, be more careful. I just got here, and there's already chaos," Genevieve muttered in a cold, accusatory tone, lightly shaking the leg of her silver trousers, as if fearing the coffee might magically jump onto her. She made no move to approach him. She did not ask if he had been burned, or if he was all right. She simply stared back at her phone, resuming her distant pose, as if the incident were a minor inconvenience unworthy of her attention. Ethan closed his eyes, clenching his jaw so hard that the muscles in his face stood out. Humiliation burned in his chest, a bitter, familiar flame. He was about to yell, to unleash months of accumulated fury against her when he felt something unexpected, a soft touch, real human warmth. He opened his eyes. Clara had not flinched at the shouts or the mess. The young employee had immediately knelt on the cold marble floor, directly in front of the wheelchair. The warm, ambient lighting of the living room highlighted the softness of her face as she completely ignored the spilled porcelain and dripping coffee. Instead of frantically cleaning the floor to avoid a reprimand, Clara had extended her hands towards Ethan. With infinite delicacy, she took his tense, clenched hand between hers. Clara's hands were soft yet firm, hands that knew hard work, but at that moment conveyed only peace. Ethan looked down, stunned. Clara was kneeling before him, the hem of her grey dress brushing the stained floor, the whiteness of her apron illuminated by the light streaming through the large windows. She wasn't looking at the mess. She wasn't looking at Genevieve. Her large, expressive dark eyes were fixed directly on Ethan's eyes. The expression on the employee's face was something Ethan hadn't seen in the mansion since the day of his accident. There was no pity, no repulsion, nor the cold calculation he saw daily in his fiancée's eyes. On Clara's face, there was only genuine, attentive, deeply compassionate, and caring concern. "Mr. Blackwood, are you all right? Are you hurt?" Clara asked in a warm whisper, her voice caressing the tense air of the room. Her thumbs gently stroked the back of Ethan's hand, an instinctive gesture of comfort that completely broke through the magnate's iron defenses. For an instant, time in the immense Rosedale living room seemed to stop. Ethan looked at the beautiful young woman kneeling before him, holding his hand as if it were something precious. While a few feet away, the woman who supposedly loved him still stood, clad in silver, staring at a bright screen, indifferent to the broken man beside her. That touch, that attentive gaze from Clara, was a tiny spark falling on the dry, dark forest of Ethan's soul, and for the first time in a year, the millionaire felt something within him strongly beat again. The contact of Clara's hands on Ethan's skin was like an electric shock in a circuit that had been off for months. It wasn't the painful electricity of his damaged nerves, but a jolt of pure humanity. Ethan was paralyzed, not by his physical condition, but by the shock of such a simple, yet profoundly unfamiliar gesture in his daily life. The young employee's fingers, slightly rough from daily work but immensely warm, held his hand with a firmness that demanded nothing in return, except to assure him that he was not alone amidst that absurd chaos of broken porcelain and disdain. The bitter aroma of spilled dark coffee began to permeate the dense air of the room, competing with the overly sweet, floral, and expensive perfume Genevieve left in her wake. Ethan swallowed, feeling a rough knot in his throat. It had been so long since anyone had touched him without a medical protocol involved. Doctors palpated him looking for non-existent reflexes. Nurses moved him with the mechanical efficiency of someone handling a heavy load. But Clara was touching him, to anchor him to reality, to offer him an ephemeral refuge from the cold indifference emanating from the woman dressed in silver a few feet away. I'm fine, Clara," Ethan managed to articulate. His voice sounded hoarser and deeper than usual, rusty from lack of use in conversations that truly mattered. He slowly withdrew his hand, not out of rejection, but because a strange sense of vulnerability overcame him. However, the thermal imprint of the young woman's fingers seemed to have remained etched on his skin. Genevieve, hearing the interaction, let out a sigh laden with theatrical annoyance. She finally put down her cell phone, placing it in the tiny pocket of her metallic jacket with a sharp movement. She looked at the scene before her, the dark liquid staining the immaculate Carrara marble floor, the fragments of the cup scattered like sad confetti, and her fiancé, the man who owned a financial empire of hundreds of millions of dollars, staring intently at a simple domestic employee. "For the love of God, what a drama over a little coffee," Genevieve snapped, crossing her arms. Her tone was sharp, devoid of any hint of empathy. "Clara, clean up this mess immediately. The burnt smell is making me nauseous, and make sure you don't stain my bags." That limited edition from Paris didn't survive a transatlantic flight to end up ruined on my own floor. There was no apology. There was no Ethan. Are you really not splashed? Genevieve simply turned on her towering, impractical silver heels and began to walk towards the majestic spiral staircase that led to the east wing of the mansion where her private rooms were located. I'll be in my room. The traffic in Yorkville was infernal, and I have a headache. No one bother me until dinner time, and if possible, make it something light. This situation has me completely exhausted. She tossed it into the air without looking back, as if the mere act of existing in the same house as a man in a wheelchair was a titanic burden draining her youth. The echo of her footsteps faded until silence again enveloped the large living room. Ethan clenched his fists on the armrests of his titanium chair. The word exhausted resonated in his mind like a cruel mockery. Exhausted from what, Genevieve? From swiping her black credit card at exclusive bank terminals? Clara, oblivious to the magnate's internal storm, silently nodded at the order of the woman who had just disappeared. Without losing her composure, she stood up gracefully and quickly. Ethan watched her intently. There was no demeaning submission in the young woman's movements. There was a silent dignity, a stoic professionalism that reminded him of the discipline he himself used to demand from his executive directors before the accident. The employee quickly brought microfiber cloths and cleaning products. She knelt again, this time to carefully pick up the porcelain fragments, making sure not to cut herself. Then, she began to absorb the dark liquid from the marble. Ethan noticed how the afternoon light, timidly entering through the immense windows, outlined Clara's serene profile. He observed the fine lines of tiredness around her dark eyes, a real tiredness born of honest work and physical effort. A brutal contrast to Genevieve's frivolous exhaustion. Leave it, Clara. Can you call someone else to finish mopping the floor? Ethan said softly, almost in a whisper, suddenly feeling a strange discomfort seeing her on her knees cleaning up the mess that his own lack of mobility had indirectly caused. Clara stopped the cloth for a second and looked up at him. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. A smile that didn't show teeth but lit up her gaze. It's no bother, Mr. Blackwood. It's my job to keep this house immaculate. Besides, if the marble absorbs the coffee, the stain will be much harder to remove tomorrow, she replied in a soft, melodic voice that lacked the sharp, artificial tone he had grown accustomed to in his social circle. She finished cleaning and stood up, holding the porcelain wreckage in a damp cloth. Before retreating to the kitchen, Clara paused for an instant and looked directly into his eyes, breaking the invisible barrier that usually separates mansion owners from those who keep them alive. If you need anything else, sir, or if you simply want me to make you a fresh tea and bring it to the library so you can be more at ease, you just have to tell me. Ethan felt a strange knot in his stomach. So you can be more at ease. Clara had perfectly read the tension in the room. She had perceived his humiliation, his contained fury, and instead of ignoring him like everyone else, she was offering him an out, a small act of genuine care. Thank you, Clara. For now, I just want to be alone, he replied, softening his tone, something rare for the man who used to make entire boards of directors tremble with a single glance. Clara nodded with a slight bow of her head and quietly walked away. Ethan remained alone in the center of the immense room. He looked at his inert legs, wrapped in the gray fabric of his track pants. For the past year, he had believed his greatest tragedy was losing the ability to walk. But that afternoon, as the echo of Genevieve's heels still buzzed in his ears and the memory of Clara's touch still burned in his hand, he understood a much more terrifying truth. His real tragedy wasn't being trapped in a wheelchair, but being trapped in a false life, surrounded by parasites who adored his checkbook but felt repulsion for his broken body. That night, for the first time since the accident, Ethan Blackwood did not dream of the car crash. He dreamed of a pair of warm hands holding him firmly in the darkness. 3 days had passed since the incident in the main living room, 3 days in which the dynamics in the Blackwood mansion had subtly changed, not in grand actions, but in a silent heaviness. Ethan spent most of his time in his private study, an imposing room paneled in dark walnut and lined with bookshelves filled with books on economics, law, and history that he rarely glanced at anymore. From his large mahogany desk, equipped with 3 state-of-the-art monitors, he continued to control his empire. He watched his stocks rise, how real estate projects in the Canadian Rockies sold at record prices, and how his liquid fortune continued to multiply as an autonomous entity. He had $400 million CAD, an army of lawyers and financial advisors at his disposal, and yet he felt like the poorest, most miserable man in all of Toronto. It was Tuesday morning. The antique grandfather clock adorning one of the study's corners struck 11. Ethan was reviewing a quarterly audit report on his tablet, sliding his finger across the screen with mechanical movements when the heavy double wooden doors opened without warning. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The olfactory trail of jasmine and expensive sandalwood preceded Genevieve. Ethan looked up. Genevieve entered the study as if she owned the entire universe. She wore an elegant white linen ensemble, perfect for the spring weather that was beginning to emerge in the city, complemented by dark designer sunglasses resting on her perfectly straightened hair and a crocodile leather handbag that cost more than the annual salary of all the mansion's employees combined. She did not look like a woman who was going to stay home to keep her convalescing fiancé company. She looked like a model about to board a private jet to the Côte d'Azur. "Ethan, darling, we need to talk," Genevieve announced. The word darling sounded so empty and plastic that it sent a slight chill down Ethan's spine. She did not sit in the comfortable leather armchairs in front of the desk. She remained standing, maintaining distance, as if getting too close might infect her with some kind of misfortune. "I'm listening," he replied in a neutral tone, locking his tablet screen and intertwining his hands over his inert lap. Genevieve took off her sunglasses, with a studied movement, and toyed with them between her fingers, sporting an expression that was meant to be one of profound anguish, but more resembled the boredom of someone who has to cancel a reservation at a trendy restaurant. "It's about us, about this situation. I can't keep pretending everything is perfectly fine when it clearly isn't," she began, slowly pacing in front of the bookshelves, not looking at the titles. "Since the accident, things have been overwhelming. The trauma, the recovery, seeing you confined to that," she made a vague gesture with her hand towards the wheelchair, unable even to name the object. "To that situation has been a devastating blow to my mental health, Ethan. People don't understand how difficult it is to be the pillar of support for someone who has suffered so much." Ethan had to clench his teeth so hard, his jaw ached to keep from letting out a bitter, dry laugh. The pillar of support. In the last few months, Genevieve hadn't accompanied him to a single physical therapy session. She didn't know the names of his doctors. She wasn't there on the nights when muscle spasms prevented him from sleeping. Her version of support consisted of spending his money to alleviate her own stress from having to live under the same roof as him. "I understand," Ethan said, maintaining a stoic facade, an icy mask that years of hostile business negotiations had taught him to perfect. "And what is your proposal to alleviate that devastating impact on your mental health?" Genevieve stopped pacing and looked at him, her face suddenly lighting up, as if she had been waiting for exactly that question to deliver her prepared script. "My friends, Chloe and Isabella, have been seeing me looking very haggard lately. They've insisted, almost begged, that I need to take some time for myself, to reconnect, to heal my own emotional wounds so I can be the strong woman you need when I return," she explained, taking barely a step closer to the desk. "They've organized a small retreat a few weeks at an exclusive wellness clinic in the Swiss Alps, focused on post-traumatic stress decompression for caregivers. After that, we were thinking of going down to the Amalfi Coast in Italy for a couple of weeks. The Mediterranean air is healing, everyone knows it. I need to clear my mind, Ethan. I swear it's the only way I'll be able to go ahead with our wedding and our future." Ethan watched her in silence for long seconds. The woman's audacity was almost admirable from a clinical standpoint. She was asking him to finance a month-long luxury vacation in Europe with her friends, disguised as a therapeutic retreat for the sacrifice of being his absent fiancée. "Switzerland and Italy. A month, I suppose," Ethan murmured, resting his elbows on the armrests of his chair and intertwining his fingertips. "Sounds like an extensive and necessary treatment, darling. I promise you," she quickly added, misinterpreting Ethan's calm as a sign of approval. "There's just one small drawback. The clinic in Switzerland doesn't work with medical insurance, and they require a pretty substantial initial deposit to ensure total privacy. Plus, my black card has been having some authorization problems lately. I think my bank advisor froze the limit for security after my Paris shopping spree. I would need you to order a transfer to my personal account, just something symbolic to cover the travel expenses and the reservations in Amalfi. About $300,000 CAD should be enough so I don't have to worry about money while I'm trying to heal." $300,000 CAD, to heal from the fatigue of ignoring him. At that precise moment, a faint knock was heard at the study door. Before Ethan could respond, the door carefully opened. It was Clara. She carried a silver tray, much smaller than the previous incident, with a crystal carafe frosted with the cold of mineral water and 2 glasses. She had come to replenish the morning water, a routine duty in the house. Clara took 2 steps into the room and stopped abruptly, sensing the dense, charged atmosphere. Her eyes quickly caught Genevieve, upright and demanding, and then Ethan, whose expression, though impassive, radiated a terrifying coldness. The young employee immediately lowered her gaze, an act of respect and prudence, ready to turn around and withdraw. "Come in, Clara. Leave the water on the side table, please," Ethan ordered, his voice sounding strangely soft in contrast to the room's tension. Clara obeyed in silence, walking with light, precise steps. As she arranged the crystal carafe, Genevieve rolled her eyes, clearly irritated by the interruption of domestic service just at the climax of her financial negotiation. "As I was saying, Ethan," Genevieve resumed, ignoring Clara's presence with the same ease with which she ignored her fiancé's pain, "it's an investment in our future. A future where I'm 100% there for you. I just need you to talk to your banker today." Clara, having completed her task, turned to leave. For a fraction of a second, her dark, expressive eyes met Ethan's. In that fleeting glance, Ethan saw neither pity nor submission. He saw understanding. Clara, from her position as an employee who barely earned minimum wage plus tips, had understood exactly what was happening in that room. She had seen the leech disguised in white linen trying to extract the last drop of dignity and money from the man in the wheelchair, and suddenly, the young woman's eyes conveyed a silent and profound indignation on his behalf. Clara closed the door softly behind her with a click. Ethan stared at the varnished wood for a moment before fixing his eyes, now cold as ice blocks, on his fiancée. The farce had reached its limit. The masks had just fallen to the floor, shattering into irreparable pieces. "I'll talk to my banker, Genevieve," Ethan finally said. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotional inflection. It was the same tone he used when deciding to liquidate a rival company. "Pack your bags." Genevieve smiled, a radiant, victorious, and absolutely hollow smile. "I knew you'd understand, my love. You're the best. I promise I'll come back completely refreshed," she said, blowing him a kiss from a distance before turning on her heels and leaving the study, eager to call her friends and confirm reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants in the Mediterranean. Ethan was left alone once more. He looked at the iced water Clara had just served, reached out, took the glass, and took a long drink. The cold water went down his throat, quenching the fire of rage that threatened to consume him. Genevieve thought she had won. She thought she was still manipulating a vulnerable and wealthy disabled man, but she didn't know she had just awakened a sleeping giant. As he watched the city's gray skyline through his study windows, Ethan Blackwood's brilliant, calculating mind, the same mind that had forged a $400 million empire, began to devise a plan. He was no longer going to be a passive victim. He was going to excise the tumor that was Genevieve from his life, and he was going to do it in the only way she would understand, by hitting the only organ she truly loved, her bank account. And as he mentally outlined the legal details of his revenge, the image of Clara, with her deep gaze and warm hands, settled into a quiet corner of his mind, giving him a strange and unexpected strength to begin the battle. The digital clock on Ethan's nightstand read 3:14 a.m. The red glow of the numbers was the only light source in the immense master bedroom of the mansion. Outside, the night breeze of Toronto gently rustled the treetops in the Rosedale Gardens. But inside, the silence was absolute and oppressive. Ethan lay on his king-sized bed, eyes fixed on the vaulted ceiling. Insomnia was no new enemy. Since the accident, nights had become a solitary battlefield. His mind, accustomed to processing data at dizzying speeds, closing multi-million-dollar deals in fractions of a second, and anticipating global market movements, now spun in vicious circles, trapped in a body that refused to obey. That particular night, the phantom pain in his legs was sharp, an electric pang coursing through dead nerves, a cruel reminder of what he had lost. However, it wasn't the physical pain that kept him awake, but the overwhelming clarity he had achieved that afternoon in his study. The image of Genevieve, in her white linen suit and empty smile, demanding $300,000 CAD to heal from her indifference, replayed in his head. Rage had given way to cold, calculated determination, but the process had left him with a nervous energy impossible to dissipate. With a sigh of frustration, Ethan propelled himself with his strong arms, moving his torso with the dexterity he had acquired over months of forced rehabilitation, and transferred himself from the bed to his wheelchair. The faint hum of the high-tech chair's motors barely broke the room's silence. He didn't turn on the main lights. He navigated the mansion's wide corridors, guided only by moonlight filtering through the enormous windows, casting long shadows over the artworks and marble sculptures that adorned his home. His destination wasn't specific. He simply needed to move, to escape the oppression of his bedroom. His hands spun the wheel rims with a constant rhythm, a mechanical exercise that helped him think. Almost without realizing it, he headed downstairs, crossed the immense formal dining room, and pushed open the swinging door that led to the main kitchen. The Blackwood Mansion kitchen was a space of industrial proportions, designed by professional chefs, dominated by stainless steel, black granite countertops, and appliances rarely used to their maximum capacity. Upon entering, Ethan stopped short. He wasn't alone. At the opposite end, illuminated only by the small warm light of the range hood above the stove, sat Clara. She wore an outfit completely different from the strict gray and white uniform of her working hours. She wore simple cotton pants and a thick wool sweater that was a bit too big for her, giving her an air of vulnerability and tiredness. Her hair was down, falling in dark waves over her shoulders. In front of her, on the cold granite island, steamed a cup of tea, and beside it rested a thick book with worn pages and sticky notes. The sound of the wheelchair startled her. Clara slammed the book shut and quickly stood up, an expression of genuine surprise and slight concern crossing her face. "Mr. Blackwood, I apologize. I didn't expect anyone to be down at this hour." "I was. The insomnia." "I'll clean this up and retire to my room immediately," she said, her voice hurried, showing the conditioned reflex of someone who knows that their presence in main areas outside of service hours is usually cause for reprimand in a house of that level. Ethan raised a hand, stopping her movement. For the first time in months, he didn't want the person in front of him to disappear. "Don't apologize, Clara, and please sit down. I'm not here to do a nightly inspection." His voice sounded hoarser than usual, devoid of a boss's authoritative tone. "I can't sleep either." Clara hesitated for a second, her large dark eyes scrutinizing the magnate's face in the dim light. She saw the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw, and slowly sat back down on the high stool. Ethan advanced with his wheelchair until he was on the other side of the granite island, facing her, separated by the dark marble and the steaming teacup. Silence settled between them. But it wasn't the dense, accusatory silence he shared with Genevieve. It was an expectant, almost peaceful silence. "What are you reading?" Ethan asked, breaking the ice, pointing his chin at the worn book. Clara looked down at the cover, and a faint shadow of shyness crossed her face. She slid her fingers over the worn cover. "It's a university human anatomy and physiology textbook," she confessed softly. "It's an old edition, but the basic information doesn't change." Ethan raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued. He knew the profile of the employees his housekeeper hired. They were usually hard-working women without much academic training. "You study medicine?" he inquired. Clara let out a small, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "I was studying specialized nursing, to be exact. I had to quit 2 years ago, in my 4th semester. My father got seriously ill, and medical expenses in this country don't spare anyone. I had to start working full-time to help at home. Student shifts at the hospital didn't pay the bills, but cleaning houses in Rosedale." Ethan watched her intently. There was a fierce dignity in her response. There was no self-pity or victim's tone, just the naked exposition of a brutal reality that he, from his $400 million CAD ivory tower, barely managed to theoretically comprehend. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. "It wasn't an empty courtesy. You don't have to be, sir. It's life. You do what you have to do for the people you love," she replied naturally, taking a sip of her tea. "And what brings you to the kitchen at 3 a.m.? Pain." The question was so direct, so devoid of the usual pity his acquaintances professed, that Ethan felt disarmed. With Genevieve, the topic of his body was taboo. With his doctors, it was a set of symptoms. Clara asked him, as one human being concerned for another. "Sometimes it's the phantom pain in my legs. The brain is cruel. It keeps sending signals to places that no longer respond," Ethan explained, his voice losing its usual harshness, becoming thoughtful. "But tonight, it's not that. It's the noise in my head." Clara nodded slowly, resting her elbows on the granite island. "Sometimes, when the body is forced to stop, the mind tries to compensate by accelerating. It's exhausting, like trying to run a marathon while tied to a chair." Ethan looked at her intently. That phrase encapsulated exactly his personal hell of the last 12 months. No one had expressed it to him with such clarity and empathy. "Exactly that," Ethan murmured. "Before the accident, my life was pure speed, constant expansion. I believed my value was tied to my ability to move, to conquer spaces, to relentlessly generate wealth. When I woke up in that hospital and they told me I wouldn't walk again, I felt that the man I was had died on that highway. What remained is just a bank account manager, dead weight." Clara frowned. Her dark eyes shone with a sudden intensity in the dim light of the kitchen. It wasn't pity they reflected, but profound disagreement. "With all due respect, Mr. Blackwood," That's utter nonsense, Clara said, her tone firm and clear, completely forgetting the hierarchy that separated them. Ethan blinked, surprised. No one dared to speak to him like that. No one dared to contradict his pain. Nonsense? He repeated, almost defensively. Yes, nonsense, Clara reaffirmed, leaning forward. Do you believe your power was in your legs? Do you believe your value was in tailored suits and walking into a boardroom? But I've seen how you manage your life from that chair. I've heard how you resolve business crises over the phone in your office. You didn't lose your mind, you didn't lose your willpower, and you definitely haven't lost your ability to impact the world. You just changed the vehicle. Ethan was speechless. The young woman's relentless sincerity struck directly at the foundations of his depression. A man is not a machine to be discarded because a couple of gears break, Clara continued, her voice softening but maintaining its firmness. I've seen people lose everything: health, family, home. And the real tragedy is never the loss itself, but letting the loss define the rest of your days. You have resources most people can't even dream of. You can do incredible things, but you choose to be locked in here, believing your life is over. The silence that followed was absolute. Only the faint hum of the high-tech refrigerator could be heard. Ethan processed Clara's words. They were a balm and a slap at the same time. For months, he had tolerated Genevieve's hypocrisy and his partner's condescension. But here, in the middle of the night, a young woman who cleaned his floors was delivering him the hardest and most compassionate truth he had ever heard. You're right, Ethan finally whispered, the icy barrier around his heart beginning to dangerously crack. I've let the wrong people dictate my worth. Clara smiled, a warm and comforting smile that illuminated the dimness. Don't let anyone convince you that you are less, Ethan. No one. It was the first time she had omitted Mr., and to Ethan it seemed the most beautiful name in the world, pronounced by that voice. They spent the rest of the early morning talking, not about business or tragedies, but about frustrated dreams, her childhood in a working-class neighborhood of the city, and the true loneliness Ethan felt at the pinnacle of his empire. When the first rays of sun began to tinge the Rosedale sky purple, Ethan Blackwood was no longer the same bitter man who had entered the kitchen. He had woken from a long slumber. At 10 a.m. that same Tuesday, the sun flooded Ethan Blackwood's immense study. The energy in the room was palpable, electric, and radically different from the melancholy that usually reigned there. Ethan sat in his wheelchair behind the imposing mahogany desk, but his posture had changed. He was no longer hunched or absent. His back was straight, his shoulders tense, and his dark eyes gleamed with fierce, calculating intensity. He wore a perfectly cut black cotton shirt, abandoning the gray of his depression for the first time in months. Facing him, perched on the edge of an Italian leather armchair, with a leather briefcase open on his knees, sat Arthur Campbell. Arthur was Ethan's chief corporate lawyer, a ruthless 50-year-old man, famous in Canadian financial circles for being a cold-blooded legal predator. He wore a dark gray tailored suit and looked at his boss with a mixture of absolute disbelief and growing alarm. Ethan, I beg you to listen to me carefully. What you're asking me to do is not only logistically insane, but it borders on reckless, Arthur said, adjusting his rimless glasses. You have a personal and corporate fortune valued at over $400 million CAD. Your holding company is one of the strongest on the continent. Faking a financial collapse of this magnitude, the seismic waves in the market could be real. We could scare away actual investors. Ethan rested his elbows on the desk and intertwined his fingers, leaning towards his lawyer with glacial calm. I don't pay you to lecture me on market volatility, Arthur. I pay you to execute my strategies, and this is my strategy. I don't care if Blackwood Holdings shares drop 3 points this week. I'll get them back next month. What I need is a perfect illusion, watertight, indisputable. Arthur sighed deeply, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He knew that when Ethan adopted that tone, there was no turning back. It was the same tone he had used to destroy 3 competitors in the acquisition of the Cancun hotel zone 5 years ago. The shark had returned to the surface, even if he was tied to a chair. All right, the lawyer conceded, pulling out a legal pad and a gold pen. If we're going to do this, we have to do it in a way that withstands any superficial scrutiny for at least a week. What narrative do you want? Problems with the Canada Revenue Agency. Tax evasion is very vulgar. Too vulgar and easy to solve with a check, Ethan replied sharply. I need something catastrophic, an act of force majeure, something that screams total and imminent ruin and freezes my assets internationally. Arthur nodded, his legal brain beginning to work on the fiction. Okay, we could simulate a monstrous international litigation, A group of European investors accusing your technology subsidiary of massive corporate fraud and illicit patent appropriation. I'll draft fake documents indicating that a U.S. federal court, in coordination with Swiss and Canadian authorities, has issued an emergency temporary restraining order, a precautionary freeze on all your global assets, personal accounts, trusts, and corporate credit lines. We'll argue that the alleged fraud exceeds your net worth. Effectively, in the filtered public eye, you would be technically bankrupt until the lawsuit is resolved, which could take years. Ethan nodded slowly, a sharp smile forming on his lips. It was the perfect plan. Excellent. I want you to prepare those documents today, to look absolutely authentic with seals, signatures, impenetrable legal language. That's easy, Arthur retorted, scribbling furiously. The problem is operational execution. If we freeze your cards and cut your liquidity for the charade to be credible, you're going to have real problems keeping this mansion running, paying salaries. I have enough cash in safes to keep my loyal staff secretly paid for months, and I have offshore accounts in tax havens under shell corporations that even you don't fully know about, Arthur. I'm not going to starve, but to the world, and specifically to my dear fiancée, my credit limit today is $0 CAD. Arthur looked up from the pad, finally understanding the motivation behind all this absurd theater. Genevieve, the lawyer said, his tone revealing barely disguised contempt. He had never liked the woman. He considered her a financial and emotional liability for his star client. Exactly, Genevieve, Ethan confirmed, his gaze darkening. Yesterday, she demanded $300,000 CAD to go on vacation to Switzerland because my physical condition causes her stress. She needs a spiritual retreat paid for by my suffering. She's convinced that I'm simply an inexhaustible ATM strapped to a wheelchair. I'm going to shut down the ATM. Do you want to see how she reacts when the ship starts to sink? I want to see how quickly she jumps into the sea and who she steps on in her way to the lifeboats, Ethan corrected, his voice dripping with venom. Arthur, I want you to cancel all credit cards associated with my accounts immediately, especially the American Express Centurion extensions. Genevieve has have them declined today. And I want a very well-founded rumor about the international investigation and the freezing of my accounts leaked to the specialized financial press by early tomorrow morning. Arthur snapped his briefcase shut with a metallic click. There was a gleam of admiration in his eyes. Consider it done, Ethan. Her cards will bounce before noon, and by 8 a.m. tomorrow, Bloomberg Canada and the Globe and Mail will be trying to confirm the fall of your empire. Prepare for the storm. I've been waiting for it for a year, Ethan murmured. As Arthur Campbell left the study to set in motion the controlled destruction machinery, Ethan turned his wheelchair towards the immense windows overlooking the garden. He knew Genevieve was at that very moment in Yorkville, having lunch at some exclusive restaurant, probably trying to book first-class tickets to Zurich. The trap was set. The trial by fire had begun. The paraplegic millionaire was about to lose all his paper money, but for the first time since his car accident, Ethan Blackwood felt he was about to reclaim his life, and in the back of his mind, the image of Clara in the kitchen, with her anatomy book and her unwavering gaze, gave him the absolute certainty that he was making the right decision. He was going to burn the forest to see who would stay to help him plant the new seeds. The atmosphere in the exclusive Yorkville restaurant was a symphony of clinking crystal glasses, discreet laughter, and the constant murmur of the city's elite, closing deals and showing off their latest acquisitions. Genevieve Dubois was seated at the best table on the terrace, surrounded by her two best friends, Chloe and Isabella. The three women shared a bottle of rosé champagne that cost as much as a modest apartment's rent for a year. Genevieve, looking impeccable in her white linen ensemble, gracefully moved her hands, as she described in luxurious detail, the suite with a view of Lake Geneva that Ethan was supposedly going to finance that very afternoon. She was exultant, savoring in advance the freedom of being away from the oppressive mansion and the depressing sight of her fiancé confined to a wheelchair. And I swear, girls, if I don't get out of that house soon, I'm going to go crazy, Genevieve said, taking a delicate sip from her glass. Ethan has become so dark, so bitter. He's no longer the brilliant magnetic man I got engaged to. Now he's just a shadow, dead weight draining my life energy. I need this clinic in Switzerland to detox from his pity. Chloe nodded with rehearsed sympathy, stroking the rim of her glass. You're right, Genevieve, no one judges you. You've been a saint for staying by his side all these months. Other women would have fled the day of the accident. You deserve this break. The conversation was interrupted by the elegant and silent waiter, dressed in an immaculate black vest, who approached the table carrying the discreet leather folder with the bill and a wireless terminal. Genevieve, without even looking at the total amount, which ran into several $1,000s, took her heavy American Express Centurion card, the famous black card from her designer handbag, and placed it on the table with a regal gesture of disdain. The waiter inserted the card into the terminal. Genevieve continued talking about the spa treatments she planned to book. The seconds passed. The small screen of the terminal flickered. The waiter frowned slightly, removed the card, and reinserted it, this time trying to swipe the magnetic stripe. Another dull, short error. Beep. "Excuse me, miss." "Dubois," the waiter murmured, bending discreetly so as not to alert the other tables. "There seems to be an authorization problem. The transaction has been declined." Silence fell over the three friends' table. Genevieve stopped her monologue and looked at the waiter as if he had just insulted her in a foreign language. A blush began to creep up her perfect neck. "That's absurd," Genevieve hissed, snatching the card from his hands. "It must be a problem with your ridiculous machine. Try again and make sure you press the correct buttons." "It's a Centurion. For God's sake, it has no limit." The waiter, maintaining impeccable professional calm, repeated the process in front of her. The screen again displayed the same message in red letters. "Declined. Contact your bank." Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep into Genevieve's stomach. She frantically opened her handbag and pulled out another card, a Visa Infinite from Ethan's Swiss bank. "Take this. Charge it at once. I'm in a hurry," she ordered, her voice losing all previous sophistication and acquiring a sharp, desperate tone. But the result was the same. Declined. Chloe and Isabella exchanged a quick glance, laden with a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity. Genevieve, now with slightly trembling hands, pulled out her latest smartphone to call her bank advisor and scream until the line went dead. However, upon turning on the screen, the entire world seemed to collapse on her shoulders. She had dozens of accumulated notifications. WhatsApp messages, Bloomberg news alerts, Twitter notifications, and emails. They all said practically the same thing. Her eyes widened excessively as she read the headline of the latest financial news alert. Urgent. Magnate Ethan Blackwood's global accounts frozen after international court order for massive fraud. Blackwood Holdings on the brink of technical collapse. Total asset loss estimated. All color drained from Genevieve's face. Her breath caught in her throat. She read the headline over and over, her mind refusing to process the words. Massive fraud. Frozen. Total loss. Suddenly, the lack of funds on the cards made terrifying sense. The $400 million CAD empire no longer existed. The infinite safety net that separated her from poverty and mediocrity had just evaporated into thin air. "Genevieve, are you all right?" "You're pale," Isabella asked, noticing the absolute terror in her friend's eyes. Genevieve abruptly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the terrace floor. She didn't respond, didn't say goodbye, didn't even look at the unpaid bill. She grabbed her handbag and ran towards the restaurant exit, pushing a couple of diners on her way to the valet parking. The drive in her armored SUV from Yorkville to the Rosedale mansion was a blur of furious tears, hysterical shouts at the wheel, and phone calls that went straight to voicemail. When the immense wrought iron gates of the property opened, Genevieve slammed the accelerator, skidding on the circular gravel of the main entrance. She entered the house like a destructive hurricane. The heavy mahogany doors burst open with a crash that echoed through every corner of the double-height foyer. "Ethan!" her voice shrieked, sharp and raspy, breaking the mansion's usual silence. "Ethan, where the hell are you?" She strode towards the main living room. There, in the exact center of the room, under the immense crystal chandelier, he was waiting for her. Ethan Blackwood sat in his titanium wheelchair, impeccably dressed in black, his hands clasped in his lap. His face was a mask of absolute and terrifying calm. He watched Genevieve enter the room, her hair disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her breathing ragged. She looked like a cornered wild animal. "I was expecting you, Genevieve," Ethan said, his voice deep, profound, and devoid of any visible emotion. "I suppose you've already seen the news, or more likely, you tried to buy something and discovered that the well ran dry." Genevieve hurled her expensive crocodile handbag against one of the velvet sofas. She advanced towards him, her eyes sparking with rage. "Tell me it's a lie," she demanded, pointing a trembling finger at him. "Tell me it's a stupid tax strategy by your lawyers. Tell me you didn't just lose everything in some illegal business, Ethan." Ethan looked her in the eyes, absorbing every drop of her hysteria. It was exactly as he had imagined. There was no concern for him, no fear that he might go to jail, only panic over money. "It's not a lie, Genevieve." Ethan lied with a fluidity and conviction that chilled her blood. "The litigation is real. European authorities intervened this morning in coordination with the Canada Revenue Agency. They've frozen all accounts, all trusts. Properties are under precautionary embargo. Technically, we're bankrupt. They've completely cut off my liquidity. Lawyers say this will take years to resolve, and most likely, I'll have to liquidate everything I have left to pay fines and avoid extradition. There's no more money, Genevieve. No clinic in Switzerland. No trip to Italy. I'll barely be able to maintain this house for a couple of weeks before the banks reclaim it. The impact of Ethan's words hit Genevieve with the physical force of a freight train. She clutched her head, stepping back as if he had just pointed a weapon at her. No, this can't be happening to me, she began to mutter, pacing the room like a caged beast. Not to me. I didn't sign up for this, Ethan. I didn't endure this whole nightmare of your accident to end up on the street. The nightmare of my accident? Ethan repeated, his voice dropping a tone, becoming dangerous. You endured the nightmare? I was the one crushed under the metal. Genevieve, I was the one who lost my legs. You only lost a dance partner for your society parties. Genevieve's mask shattered definitively. She turned towards him, her face contorted in a grimace of pure contempt and repulsion. All cold courtesy, all empty excuses disappeared. Yes, I endured it, she screamed at the top of her lungs. You lost your legs, but I lost my life, Ethan. Do you think I liked being locked in this tomb with you? Do you think I liked looking at you every day and remembering the powerful man you were and seeing what you became? You're a cripple, Ethan. You're a depressed, bitter, invalid who makes me pity you and disgusts me. The echo of the words cripple and disgusts me bounced off the marble walls, amplifying in the vast room. Ethan did not physically flinch, but inwardly, the cruel validation of his worst fears pierced his chest. It was true. She had always seen him that way. I stayed because I loved you. Or at least I loved what you represented, Genevieve continued, tears of self-pity streaming down her cheeks, ruining her makeup. I stayed because we had a tacit agreement. I kept up appearances, and you financed my peace of mind, but now you have nothing. You are nothing. You're just half a man tied to a chair, and on top of that ruined. I'm not going to sink with you. I'm too young and too beautiful to become the nurse of a poor, broken man. Genevieve didn't wait for Ethan to respond. In a final act of contempt, she ripped the engagement ring from her finger. The 5-carat diamond shone one last time before she threw it forcefully towards him. The jewel bounced against Ethan's chest and fell to the marble floor with a sharp, sad tinkle. Without looking back, Genevieve turned and ran towards the monumental staircase. She climbed the steps 2 at a time. Ethan remained silent in the center of the room, listening to the chaotic noises coming from upstairs. Closet doors slamming open, drawers crashing, the metallic sound of zippers and clasps of suitcases being forced shut. Genevieve was looting everything she could carry: jewelry, watches, designer clothes. She was taking the wreckage. An hour later, Genevieve came downstairs, followed by 2 of the house's drivers, who silently carried a mountain of designer luggage. She did not look towards the living room, where Ethan remained motionless. She walked directly to the main door. The final slam of the door resonated like a cannon shot in the Blackwood mansion. The woman in silver was gone. From the dining room entrance, hidden in the shadows, Clara had witnessed everything. She had heard the shouts, the humiliations, the word disgust. Her heart ached seeing Ethan's solitary figure in the middle of the large room. She approached him slowly, in silence. Ethan wasn't crying. His eyes were fixed on the diamond ring that gleamed on the cold marble floor like a small, pathetic dead star. Ethan had believed he was prepared. He had coldly planned the test. He had anticipated Genevieve's reaction, and logically, he knew her departure confirmed everything he suspected. However, the human brain is a treacherous organ, and logic rarely protects the heart from the brutal impact of words. To hear the poison come directly from the mouth of the woman he planned to marry, to hear aloud that his broken body inspired disgust, was a devastating blow that fractured his remaining defenses. The days that followed Genevieve's departure were a downward spiral into a dark, suffocating abyss. Ethan did not return to his study. He cancelled all virtual meetings with Arthur Campbell and his board of directors. The farce of his financial ruin remained alive in the news, but the emotional ruin that consumed him was absolutely real. He locked himself in his immense master bedroom in the west wing of the mansion. He ordered the heavy, velvety burgundy curtains drawn, plunging the space into perpetual gloom, regardless of whether it was noon or midnight. He refused to sit in his wheelchair. Moving from bed to chair required a physical and mental effort he was no longer willing to make. He stayed in bed, motionless, staring at the vaulted ceiling, letting himself be consumed by the shadows. Depression nested in his chest like a block of lead. The phantom pains in his legs, which used to be occasional episodes, became a constant torment, a psychosomatic response to emotional trauma. He felt the pangs, the electric fire coursing through calves that didn't feel the brush of the sheets, and he didn't even bother to take painkillers. He wanted to feel the pain. He believed it was all he deserved. The rest of the mansion staff was terrified. The housekeeper, a strict and traditional woman, instructed all employees not to approach the West Wing unless called, firmly believing the rumor of imminent bankruptcy and fearing the master's outbursts of rage. The food timidly left on trays outside his door returned hours later, untouched, cold and sad. Ethan was starving himself, letting himself wither in the dark, but Clara Mackenzie was not like the rest of the staff. She had seen Ethan's soul that night in the kitchen, and she refused to allow the venomous words of an empty woman to extinguish the spark that was barely beginning to rekindle. On Ethan's 4th day of confinement, Clara ignored the housekeeper's direct orders. She prepared a tray with hot chicken broth, freshly baked bread, and a carafe of electrolyte water. She walked down the long corridor of the West Wing, where the air seemed denser and colder. She stopped in front of the double oak doors of the master bedroom. She did not knock. She knew he wouldn't answer. She pushed the doorknob and entered. The room smelled of confinement, cold sweat, and hopelessness. The darkness was almost total, interrupted only by a faint line of light seeping through the base of the balcony doors. Ethan lay in the center of the immense bed, a shadow among the gray blankets, with a grown beard and sunken eyes, fixed on nothingness. Clara said, not a word. She walked with determined steps to the windows. With a firm movement of her arms, she pulled the thick golden cords, throwing open the heavy burgundy curtains. The mid-morning sunlight flooded the room like an explosion of white gold. Ethan let out a hoarse groan, raising his arm to shield his eyes from the luminous assault. "Close that. Get out of here," Ethan roared. His voice was harsh, weak, and charged with broken fury. "I gave orders not to be disturbed." Clara ignored the scream, walked to the bed, and deposited the tray on the nightstand with a dry thud that echoed in the silent room. Then, she crossed her arms and looked at him from the foot of the bed, standing tall, challenging the authority of the collapsed magnate. "You haven't eaten for 4 days. Ethan, 4 days sunk in this misery because of a woman who wasn't worth a second of your time. I'm not closing the curtains, and I'm not leaving," Clara declared, her voice firm, without a hint of submission. Ethan slowly lowered his arm and looked at her, squinting through the brightness. He saw the determination in the young woman's face, the same fierce light he had seen in the kitchen, but the fog of his depression was too thick. "You don't understand anything, Clara. Go away," he muttered, turning his head towards the pillow, trying to hide again. She was right. "Look at me. I'm exactly what she said. I'm a useless body. I'm a burden. The money farce fell apart, and all that's left is a cripple." Clara felt her blood boil, not with pity, but with pure indignation. She walked around the bed until she was right beside him. She didn't stand. She sat on the edge of the mattress, invading his space, forcing him to acknowledge her presence. "The only farce here is that you believe that lie," Clara said, her voice softening slightly but maintaining a sharp intensity. "Genevieve didn't leave because you can't walk. She left because she's a parasite, an empty void that only knows how to feed off other people's money. She's the one who's broken, Ethan, not you. She looked me in the eyes and told me I disgusted her," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. A vulnerable confession he would never have made to anyone else in the world. The frustration, tears, suppressed for days, stung his tired eyes. Clara raised her hand and, with a delicacy that contrasted with the firmness of her words, brushed a lock of dark, disheveled hair from Ethan's forehead. The contact of her warm skin against the man's cold, sweaty forehead was like an anchor dropped in the middle of his stormy mind ocean. "She doesn't know what real worth is," Clara said, her dark eyes penetrating directly into the magnate's defeated gaze. "She looked at your legs or she looked at your checkbook, but she never looked at you. I see you, Ethan. I see a man who survived a tragedy that would have killed others. I see a man who has the power to change lives, who has a brilliant mind, who has a heart hidden beneath layers of ice and rage." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the knot in his throat threaten to suffocate him. Clara's warm hand moved from his forehead to his cheek, holding his face with a fierce and protective tenderness. "I won't allow you to give up. Not for her, not for anyone," Clara whispered, leaning a little closer, her breath brushing his face. "If you decide never to leave this bed again, I will sit in this chair every day, open those curtains, and remind you who you really are until the noise in your head goes silent. I'm not going to let you die a living death, Ethan Blackwood." The silent, bitter crying finally escaped Ethan's closed eyes. Tears slid down his face, wetting Clara's hand that held him. It wasn't a cry of defeat. It was the purging of all the poison accumulated over a year. He cried for the loss of his legs. He cried for the humiliation. He cried for the heartbreaking relief of not being completely alone. Clara did not move. She did not comfort him with empty words of, "Everything will be all right." She simply stayed there, holding him in his pain, being his solid and unbreakable refuge amidst the total collapse of his world. And as the sun warmed the room for the first time in days, Ethan knew, with an absolute certainty born from the depths of his scars, that this young employee had just saved his life. The warrior's awakening. The metallic and rhythmic clanging of iron weights echoed in the spacious private gym located in the south wing of the mansion. 6 weeks had passed since Genevieve's catastrophic departure and Ethan's emotional breakdown. 6 weeks since Clara had opened his bedroom curtains, forcing him to look at the sunlight and confront the demons that kept him tied to his bed. The outside world still believed Ethan Blackwood was a ruined man. Tabloid magazines had published extensive articles about how financial tragedy had destroyed his engagement, portraying Genevieve as a collateral victim of his alleged frauds. But within the walls of Rosedale, the reality was an unstoppable force of transformation. Ethan was suspended on parallel bars, his naked torso glistening with a thick layer of sweat. The muscles in his arms, shoulders, and back strained to their limit, marked veins tracing a map of effort and voluntary pain on his skin. With a guttural grunt, he lifted his body once more, holding his entire weight in the air, ignoring the dead weight of his inert legs hanging below him. His face, once pale and emaciated by depression, now reflected an indomitable ferocity. He had traded self-pity for absolute discipline. 3 more, Ethan, don't stop now. Inertia is your enemy, a firm voice commanded from the gym doorway. It wasn't an expensive personal trainer. It was Clara. She wore her usual gray uniform, but her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows. She held a white towel and a bottle of isotonic water. Her gaze never left him, evaluating every movement with the clinical precision her nursing studies had afforded her. Ethan gritted his teeth. His triceps burned as if injected with acid, but Clara's voice was the fuel he needed. He did 1 repetition, then another. On the 3rd, his arms trembled violently, and he dropped onto the padded seat of his titanium wheelchair, which was strategically placed beneath the bars. He breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling forcefully. Clara immediately approached, handed him the towel, and opened the water bottle. "Your endurance time has increased by 20% since last week," she commented, with a small, proud smile playing on her lips. "If you keep this up, the physiotherapists will have to invent new exercises for you." Ethan took the towel and wiped his face and neck. He looked at Clara from his chair, feeling his heart rate quicken again, but this time it wasn't from physical exertion. During those 6 weeks, the dynamic between them had mutated in a way Ethan never would have imagined. Clara had willingly taken on the task of overseeing his physical and psychological rehabilitation. She had pushed him beyond his limits, not with pity, but with an unwavering faith in his capacity for recovery. "It's all thanks to the Iron Sergeant who forces me down here at 6 a.m., Ethan responded, his voice hoarse, but tinged with a warm, almost playful tone that had been absent from his repertoire for over a year. Clara let out a soft, clear laugh that echoed in the large mirrored room. That sound had become Ethan's new secret addiction. "Someone has to make sure the formidable magnate doesn't get rusty," she retorted, gently patting his shoulder before turning to arrange some weights on the rack. As she walked, Ethan watched her. He noticed the natural grace of her movements, the curve of her neck as she gathered her dark hair, the light in her eyes when they spoke of medicine or literature. Ethan realized, with a clarity that hit him with the same force as the car accident, that he was deeply and irremediably in love with her. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't dependence, it was a fierce, mature, and overwhelming love, born of admiration for the only person who had seen his shattered soul and decided to stay and pick up the pieces. However, as that thought crystallized in his mind, a cold, dark shadow slipped over his chest. Fear. Ethan looked down at his legs wrapped in black track pants. "Look at me," he thought bitterly. He was a powerful man, yes. His hidden bank account was still intact, but physically, he was half a man. Clara was young, beautiful, brilliant, with her whole life ahead of her. She could have any man who could walk alongside her down the street, dance at a party, or carry her in his arms. Why would she want to tie herself to a wheelchair? The ghost of Genevieve's words, "You disgust me," still haunted the corners of his insecurity. Ethan convinced himself that what Clara felt for him was Florence Nightingale syndrome. The caregiver who develops a protective and compassionate affection for her patient. To mistake that heroic pity for romantic desire would be the most humiliating mistake of his life. If he made a false move and confessed his feelings, he risked scaring her away, destroying the only real bond that kept him afloat. Losing her was a luxury his soul could not afford. "Ethan, are you all right?" Clara's voice pulled him from his dark thoughts. She had returned to his side, her brow slightly furrowed, noticing the sudden change in his expression, the rigidity in his jaw. "Yes," he lied quickly, forcing a smile. "I was just thinking about the virtual board meeting I have later with Arthur. The bankruptcy charade requires a lot of fake bureaucracy." Clara looked at him intently for a second, her dark eyes scrutinizing his face as if trying to read the fine print of a contract. She knew he was lying. She knew his silences better than anyone, but she decided not to press. "Good. Go shower. I've ordered a high-protein breakfast for you. I'll see you in the library in an hour," her tone soft but professional. Ethan nodded, started his chair's motors, and headed towards the adapted elevator. As the metal doors closed, separating him from her, he promised himself that he would keep his love in the darkest corner of his chest. He would protect her and help her, but he would never impose on her the burden of loving a broken man. Shared secrets. The rain beat hard against the immense windows of the mansion's library. It was an unusually cold Friday night in the capital. The fire crackled in the large carved stone fireplace, casting golden and orange glints on the thousands of leather spines of the books lining the walls from floor to ceiling. The atmosphere was one of warm intimacy, isolated from the rest of the world. Ethan sat behind a majestic antique mahogany desk, but he wasn't reviewing Blackwood Holdings documents. In front of him, on his laptop screen, shone the logos of the Bank of Canada and the admissions department of the University of Toronto, along with the records of the country's most prestigious private medical school. For the past 2 weeks, while the world believed he couldn't even pay for electricity, Ethan had used his lawyer, Arthur Campbell, and his untouchable offshore accounts to conduct a silent and exhaustive investigation. He had traced Clara's father's medical debts, those that had forced her to abandon her studies. They were exorbitant hospital bills, accumulated bank interest, and predatory loans that were drowning the Mackenzie family. With 3 precise clicks and shielded transfers through anonymous trusts, Ethan had settled every penny of that debt, but he hadn't stopped there. He had directly contacted the dean of the Faculty of Medicine, an old friend of his father's, and established a foundation for medical excellence scholarships, whose first and only lifelong beneficiary, with all expenses paid, tuition, books, and a generous monthly stipend, was Clara Mackenzie. Ethan abruptly closed the laptop when he heard the soft click of the library door opening. Clara entered. She carried a silver tray with 2 steaming cups of chamomile tea. She wore civilian clothes, fitted blue jeans, and a white knit sweater that made her look painfully beautiful in the firelight. The contrast between the domestic employee of the first months and the confident woman who now walked towards him was absolute. "I thought you might need something warm. The cold has seeped throughout the house," she said, approaching the desk and setting the tray aside. "Thank you, Clara. Please, sit down. I want to talk to you." Ethan gestured to one of the leather armchairs in front of him. His voice sounded different, solemn, lacking the casual tone of their recent interactions. Clara noticed the seriousness and sat on the edge of the armchair, crossing her hands in her lap. The firelight illuminated half of her face, giving her an expectant air. "Is something wrong, Ethan? Is it about the lawyer's case?" she asked, genuine concern tinging her voice. "No, my lawyers have absolute control of that farce. This is about you." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and intertwining his fingers. "We've spent many early mornings talking in that kitchen. You've given me my life back, Clara. You've taught me to fight again when I only wanted to give up. And all this time, you've told me about your hospital shifts, the adrenaline of emergency rooms, the frustration of not being able to finish what you started." Clara looked down at her hands. The subject of her truncated career was a wound that, although scarred, still hurt to the touch. "We've talked about this, Ethan. It was years ago. My reality is different now, and I'm at peace with my decisions. My father is stable. We have a roof over our heads. I'm not complaining. But it's not your place." Ethan interrupted her, his tone firm and categorical. "Your place is not cleaning my floors or pushing me in this chair. Your brilliant mind, your empathy, your hands belong in an operating room, in a hospital. They belong to medicine." Clara let out a tired sigh, looking up to meet the magnate's intense eyes. "Dreams cost money, Ethan, money my family doesn't have. It's simple, cruel math. I can't go back. Ethan reached out and picked up a thick manila envelope that rested on the edge of his desk. He handed it to her in silence. Clara hesitated a second before taking it. The paper was heavy. She opened it slowly and extracted the documents it contained. Her eyes scanned the pages. First, the full liquidation letters from the 3 banks, and the private hospital where her father had been treated paid in full stamps. Then, an official admission certificate from the Faculty of Medicine, accompanied by the legal statutes of a trust in her name covering her complete studies up to specialization, signed by a prestigious international law firm. Clara's hands began to tremble. The paper rustled under her fingers. Blood drained from her face in shock, and she looked up at Ethan, her eyes filled with restrained tears and an expression of absolute disbelief. "Ethan, what is this? What did you do?" Her voice was a choked whisper, about to break. "I did what I had to do," he replied, maintaining a calm he didn't feel inside. His heart was pounding. "Your father doesn't owe a single cent, and the university awaits you next semester. You have a full, non-repayable scholarship. You are free, Clara, free to be the doctor you were born to be." A single tear rolled down the young woman's cheek, but, to Ethan's surprise, it wasn't a reaction of pure joy. Clara stood up abruptly, leaving the papers on the desk. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Pride and confusion collided within her. "I can't accept this," she said, stepping back, her voice trembling. It's too much. It's millions of dollars. I'm your employee, Ethan. I'm not your charity project. I don't want you to buy my life out of pity or gratitude because I helped you out of your depression. I did it because I care about you, not to send you a bill." Ethan closed his eyes for an instant, cursing his own clumsiness. He had calculated the financial logistics perfectly, but he had underestimated the indomitable pride of the woman before him. He placed his hands on the wheels of his chair, released the brakes, and circled the immense desk until he was facing her, mere inches away. "Look at me, Clara," he commanded, his voice dropping to a deep, intimate register, vibrating in the library's silence. "Look me in the eyes and tell me if you believe this is charity." Clara looked at him. Tears now flowed freely down her face. "I am a businessman, Clara," Ethan continued, raising a hand to gently wipe a tear from her cheek, a gesture that electrified the air between them. "I have never invested a single penny out of pity in my entire life. This is not payment. This is an investment in the brightest mind and the fiercest heart I have ever known. I want you to leave this house. I don't want you to be my employee ever again." Clara softly sobbed at the thought of leaving, a sharp pain piercing her chest. "You want me to leave?" she whispered, feeling her world collapsing. "I want you to stop being my employee and stop being my nurse," Ethan clarified, his voice breaking for the first time, the barrier of his insecurity crumbling. "Because I can't stand having you close and pretending you're just that. Because it terrifies me that the only reason you care for me is out of compassion for a disabled man. And Clara, I have fallen in love with you in a way that is driving me crazy. I don't want your medical care. I want you, but I understand if a man in this chair is not." He couldn't finish the sentence. Clara, with unexpected fierceness, dropped to her knees in front of his wheelchair, exactly in the same position she had been the day Genevieve spilled the coffee, but this time there was no submission. Her hands flew to Ethan's face, holding him with a possessive and desperate strength. "Shut up," Clara whispered, their faces so close that Ethan could feel her breath trembling against his lips. "You are the most stupid and brilliant man in the world. I have never felt pity for you, Ethan Blackwood. I saw a warrior from the very first day. I saw the man beneath the broken armor. I don't care about that chair. I don't care about your money. I care about you." Ethan's dark eyes widened, the crushing weight of fear evaporating before the absolute, burning truth in Clara's gaze. "Are you sure?" he murmured, almost afraid it was all a dream, his breath catching. "I've been waiting for months for you to realize that I love you," she replied without hesitation. Ethan needed to hear no more. He slid his strong hands from Clara's shoulders to her nape, tangling his fingers in her dark, soft hair, and pulled her towards him. The kiss was an explosion of everything they had repressed for months. It wasn't timid or hesitant. It was deep, hungry, and laden with absolute devotion. Clara clung to Ethan's shoulders, responding to the kiss with the same intensity, sealing in that contact the end of his loneliness. In the middle of the library, surrounded by the sound of the storm outside and the warmth of the fire, Ethan felt that finally, after a long and dark hell, he had returned home, and he didn't need his legs to know that he was standing on top of the world. Exactly 8 weeks had passed since the night of the storm in the library. 8 weeks in which the interior of the Rosedale mansion had transformed from a cold, silent mausoleum into a vibrant home full of light, music, and the constant murmur of future plans. The outside world, however, continued to believe the great lie. Financial newspapers had speculated endlessly about Ethan Blackwood's fall from grace, detailing how his companies were supposedly bleeding under the weight of a phantom international litigation. But that Tuesday morning, the shadow play came to an end in the most spectacular way possible. At 9 a.m. sharp, the screens of the Toronto Stock Exchange trading floor and Bloomberg terminals worldwide flickered with breaking news that shattered the market. Blackwood Holdings was not only not bankrupt, but had just announced the hostile, multi-million-dollar acquisition of its largest competitor in the European technology sector, paying the entire transaction in cash. The official press release, drafted with Arthur Campbell's surgical precision, categorically denied any litigation, labeling past rumors as an exercise in corporate disinformation, orchestrated by minor competitors who had now been absorbed. Within minutes, Blackwood Holdings shares soared to an all-time high. Ethan's personal fortune, already immense, multiplied exponentially. The ruined, disabled man had just shown the world that he remained the undisputed king of the financial chessboard. 10 kilometers away, in a dingy, borrowed apartment in a less exclusive part of the city, Geneviève Dubois dropped her cheap coffee cup onto the stained carpet. She sat in front of her laptop, eyes wide, almost bulging, reading the Forbes headline, Titan's Rebirth, Ethan Blackwood executes deal of the decade, proving ruin rumors were a master trap. The air left Genevieve's lungs. She felt a paralyzing vertigo. She read the article 3 times, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of her error. There was no bankruptcy, no frozen accounts. It had all been a test, an illusion, and she had bitten the bait with the desperation of a greedy animal, throwing away a 5-carat ring and an empire of hundreds of millions of dollars just to save her own skin. Panic seized her, immediately followed by a wave of nauseating greed. She looked around, disgusted by her friend Isabella's small apartment, who had reluctantly given her asylum after the cash she stole from the mansion evaporated in luxury hotels and nervous shopping. She had to go back. She had to reclaim her place at all costs. She knew Ethan had loved her. She was convinced that his brilliant intellect hid a manipulable heart. She just had to cry, beg, claim that the false news had caused her a nervous breakdown. She dressed in the most elegant dress she still had in her suitcase, a fitted Italian design in blood red. She applied makeup to hide the dark circles from weeks of stress and ordered a premium Uber to Rosedale. She rehearsed her tears throughout the journey. When she arrived at the mansion, the immense iron gates opened without resistance. Ethan, anticipating this moment since he ordered the news to be published, had instructed security to let her pass to the main living room. Geneviève pushed open the heavy mahogany doors with the same arrogance as always, though her heart pounded wildly. She entered the foyer and walked with a determined stride towards the immense living room, expecting to find Ethan solitary and vulnerable, ready to be consoled. But the scene she found left her paralyzed. The room was flooded with natural light. The heavy brown curtains had been replaced by light white linen. In the center, sitting comfortably on one of the velvet sofas, with an iPad on her lap and several medical books piled on the coffee table, was Clara. She no longer wore the white apron or the gray maid's dress. She wore elegant and comfortable beige silk pants and a raw white silk blouse. Her dark hair fell in loose, healthy waves over her shoulders. She looked radiant, completely at home in the space, radiating a peace that instantly enraged Geneviève. Geneviève frowned, her face contorting into a mask of classist contempt. Forgetting for a second her role as the repentant fiancée, her venomous instinct took over. "What on earth are you doing sitting on my furniture?" Geneviève snapped, her voice sharp and authoritative echoing in the large room. "Has the housekeeper lost her mind letting you laze around in the main living room? Get up immediately, pick up that rubbish you have on the table, and go make me a martini. And then, I want you to pack your uniforms and get out of my house. I'm back, and I will not tolerate insubordination from the staff." Clara slowly and calmly looked up from her iPad, her dark, expressive eyes fixed on the woman dressed in red. There was no fear in her gaze, not a hint of submission. There was compassion, mixed with deep weariness, at another's stupidity. Clara did not move a millimeter. She closed her iPad cover with a soft click, leaned back against the sofa, and elegantly crossed her legs. "I'm afraid the bar is closed to you, Geneviève," Clara replied, her voice melodious but firm, devoid of the miss she used to use. "And as for my books, they will stay exactly where they are. This is my home now." The words hit Genevieve like a physical slap. She opened her mouth to let out an indignant scream, her face reddening with rage that a simple employee dared to speak to her with such authority. She took a threatening step towards the sofa, ready to drag Clara by the hair if necessary. "You insolent little girl, she began to shout, raising a hand. "I suggest you lower your hand, Genevieve, unless you want my lawyers to sue you for assault on private property before my guards drag you out." Ethan Blackwood's grave, deep, and absolutely glacial voice cut through the air from the living room threshold, freezing Genevieve in her tracks. Genevieve spun on her heels, almost losing her balance. Her eyes widened excessively as she saw Ethan. The man before her was not the depressed ghost dressed in gray track pants she had abandoned 2 months ago. Ethan Blackwood had returned in all his glory. He was in his titanium wheelchair, but he wore a custom-tailored midnight blue suit from one of London's most exclusive tailoring houses. The jacket fit his broad shoulders with martial precision. His white shirt was impeccably ironed, and his beard was trimmed with sharp lines. His posture was straight, imposing, radiating an absolute and indisputable power that filled every corner of the mansion. Seeing him, surrounded by the aura of his restored millions, Genevieve's script returned to her mind. The anger disappeared, instantly replaced by a mask of rehearsed pain. Her eyes filled with tears at will, and her lips began to tremble. She ran towards him, ignoring Clara, and dropped to her knees in front of the wheelchair, clutching the metal armrests in a grotesque and theatrical attempt to emulate the connection Clara had once established on that same marble floor. "Ethan, oh my love, my life," Genevieve sobbed, burying her face in the magnate's inert legs. "I've been so stupid. I beg you, forgive me. The news scared me so much. I panicked. My family's debts pressured me. The stress of your accident had me beside myself. I didn't know what I was doing. It was a moment of madness. I left because I thought I was freeing you from a burden, but every second away from you has been hell. I love you, Ethan. I love you, not the money." Ethan did not move a single muscle, did not raise his hands to comfort her, did not look away. He observed the top of Genevieve's head with the cold indifference of a scientist examining a defective specimen. He let her cry and beg for an entire minute, letting the silence of the room amplify the pathetic nature of her performance. Finally, Ethan spoke. His voice contained no rage. It contained something much worse, absolute disdain. "Get up, Genevieve. You're ruining the vinyl of the chair with your fake tears, and you look ridiculous." Genevieve stopped her sobs abruptly. She raised her face, mascara streaming down her cheeks in a less glamorous way than she had planned, searching for some trace of the vulnerability she used to manipulate. She found nothing. Ethan's dark eyes were 2 blocks of obsidian. Slowly, Genevieve stood up, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand, confusion and genuine fear beginning to seep through her act. "Ethan, darling, you have to believe me," she tried once more, extending a hand towards his face. Ethan pushed her hand away with a quick, sharp movement of his arm. "There's no litigation, Genevieve," Ethan said, each word falling like a block of ice. "There was no European fraud. My accounts were never frozen, and I never lost a single dollar of my fortune. I gave the order to block your credit cards. I instructed my lawyers to fabricate the fake documents, and I paid the media to leak the news of my bankruptcy. It was me." Genevieve felt the marble floor disappear beneath her feet. She stepped back, bringing both hands to her mouth. You faked everything." "Why?" she whispered, feeling nauseous at the revelation of the perfect trap. "Because I needed to see inside your soul," he replied relentlessly. "I needed to confirm what my instincts had been screaming at me since I woke up in that hospital. I wanted to know how long it would take for the rat to abandon the ship when she thought it was sinking. And you broke all my predictions, Genevieve. Not only did you flee at the first sign of poverty, but you made sure to try and destroy what little dignity I had left before walking out that door." "Ethan, I was scared," she wailed, panic devouring her as her plan completely crumbled. "You told me I disgusted you," Ethan interrupted her, raising his voice slightly, the echo of that phrase resonating for the last time in the mansion, now devoid of its power to hurt him. "You called me a cripple. You said I was only half a man and that I was stealing your youth. You said your only pain was having lost your party companion. Those words aren't said out of financial panic, Genevieve. Those words are vomited when you finally take off your mask." Ethan turned his chair slightly towards where Clara remained seated. Clara looked at him with silent pride, a soft, comforting smile on her lips. Ethan returned her gaze, and for a second, all coldness left his face, replaced by absolute devotion. Then he fixed his eyes back on Genevieve. Did you believe my worth resided in the money I could spend on you or the legs I could walk with at your social events? You were so empty, so superficial, that you couldn't see a human being in front of you. Ethan gestured to Clara with a wave of his hand. Clara picked me up when I was worth nothing in the eyes of the world. She held me when I had no money to offer her, when I was a bitter and destroyed man. She didn't kneel to ask for forgiveness or jewels. She knelt to clean up my mess and give me her hand. That is the difference between a parasite and a companion, between garbage and real worth. Genevieve looked at Clara, pure hatred distorting her delicate features. You prefer her? Genevieve spat, Bila rising in her throat. A maid from a working-class neighborhood? You're an idiot, Ethan. You'll regret this when you realize she's only with you for the money you just got back. Ethan let out a dry, humorless laugh. Clara just rejected my offer to put $1 million trust in her name. She's studying medicine on her own merit scholarship, and in a few years, she'll be saving lives while you continue looking for someone to exploit. You have no idea what respect means, much less love. Ethan pressed a button on his chair's armrest control panel. Less than 10 seconds later, 2 burly private security guards entered the room with stern expressions. The audience is over, Ethan declared, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt with absolute coldness. Escort her out and make sure her name and photograph are at all security checkpoints. If Miss Dubois approaches within 100 meters of this property, or if she attempts to contact me or my fiancé by any means, call the police and file charges for trespassing and harassment. Genevieve resisted as one of the guards took her arm firmly. You can't do this to me. We had a future, Ethan. I'm your wife, she shrieked hysterically, losing all composure as she was dragged on her heels across the immense marble floor towards the foyer. You were a bad investment, Genevieve, and I just liquidated my losses. That was the last thing Ethan said, without even raising his voice. Genevieve's sharp screams faded as the heavy main doors closed with a definitive thud, sealing her fate outside the Rosedale paradise forever. Silence returned to the great room, but this time it was not a heavy or melancholic silence. It was the silence of peace, of the storm that had finally cleared the sky. Ethan exhaled deeply, releasing the last tension from his shoulders. He heard the soft rustle of silk. Clara had risen from the sofa and walked towards him. She stopped behind his wheelchair and wrapped her arms around Ethan's broad chest, resting her cheek against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of his woody cologne. Ethan closed his eyes, raising his hands to intertwine his fingers with hers, feeling the real warmth that had saved his life. Are you all right, formidable magnate? Clara whispered against his neck, placing a kiss on his skin. Ethan turned his face, brushing his lips against hers in a caress laden with promises. I've never been better in my entire life, future doctor, he replied, opening his eyes to look at the immense room that now truly felt like home. Ethan Blackwood's story did not end with a medical miracle. Science could not return movement to his legs, and he accepted that reality with his head held high. But Clara's unwavering and profound love had achieved a much greater miracle. It had resurrected the man, given him back his purpose, and taught him that a true empire is not built with millions of dollars in bank accounts, but with the indestructible strength of 2 souls who decide never to give up on each other. And as the sunlight illuminated the crystal of the grand chandelier above them, Ethan knew that, despite being tied to a chair, he had never flown so high. The end.